You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Hard Talk with me, Sarah Montague. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme and I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Hard Talk on the BBC World Service. I'm Sarah Montague. Russia is calling on the EU to stump up billions of dollars to help rebuild Syria. I'm in the Russian mission in Brussels to speak to their representative to the EU, Vladimir Chizhov. He has said if the EU doesn't pay, it will bear the responsibility for that. But Russian planes are still destroying parts of the country, and rather than support the peace talks at the United Nations, they've set up their own parallel talks. So what responsibility do the Russians have for ending the war in Syria? Vladimir Chizhov, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
What do you mean when you say that if the EU don't pay for the reconstruction of Syria or contribute to it, they will bear the responsibility for that?
Well, the reconstruction of Syria, after the extensive damage that has been inflicted on that country during over 6 years of war, is, in my view, the responsibility of the whole international community, including, of course, the European Union. Now, the European Union has been declaring a number of times its willingness to contribute to peace settlement in Syria. So that would be one of the ways, since the European Union has admitted, rightly so, that it is not part of any military activity, it's not a military alliance. But on the economic side, it has so far limited its participation, its contribution to a share of humanitarian aid.
When you say a share, it is by far the largest donor of humanitarian aid, and we're talking about more than 10 billion euros, I mean, $12 billion. But for reconstruction, I mean, a conservative estimate, according to the UN Special Envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, is $250 billion. Why should they be paying for that now when Russian planes are still bombing Syria?
What the Russian planes have been doing throughout the over 2 years of Russia's involvement in combating terrorism there inside Syria has been destroying the facilities of ISIL and al-Nusra, which are designated by the United Nations as terrorist organizations.
And been involved in bombing hospitals.
There is no record of any deliberate bombing of hospitals. So it is a fact that those terrorist organizations have been using civilian facilities, hospitals, schools even, as shields. And also as their own headquarters.
But there are 48 hospitals run by medical aid charities, the UOSSM. They have not been acting as shields and they have been hit. And there's evidence of targeting of hospitals and medical facilities.
There is no evidence of deliberate targeting of hospitals working as hospitals.
The Atlantic Council, which is a Washington-based research institute, whose chairman is the American ambassador to Russia, produced evidence suggesting that Russia and Syria had repeatedly bombed hospitals, and they suggest had hid the evidence of that. Are you saying it's all a mistake?
Well, in operations like this, mistakes are unavoidable, certainly. But I can assure you that the strategy of the Russian Air Force and all Russian military involvement in Syria has been to destroy the assets and the headquarters primarily of those terrorist organizations. It has never been Russia's aim to destroy the infrastructure.
So when UNICEF say that medical facilities were in East Ghouta were hit just within the last few days, would you suggest that was a mistake too?
Well, East Ghouta, it has been used by opposition militants linked to al-Nusra, and however it is called now, as a springboard for attacks against the Syrian military. So what the Syrian military did was in response.
If we stay on East Ghouta, it is the case that there, an area which is effectively besieged and for which very little humanitarian aid has gone in, there have been some efforts to evacuate people. Will there be more evacuations, not least of children, in the days ahead?
Of course there will be, and humanitarian assistance will be reaching East Ghouta as other places, including difficult places inside Syria.
Russia is saying, look, to the EU, you've got to help with the reconstruction. And we're talking about, as I say, 250 billion.
Well,
how much is Russia putting up?
Not exclusively the EU, all the others.
Okay, how much is
those
Russia
who
putting
have joined the US-led coalition, I think they should also join the international effort to assist in the reconstruction of Syria.
And how will Russia join that effort? How much will it put up?
Well, I cannot give you a specific figure because there are estimates. The one that you referred to, citing Staffan de Mistura, is one estimate. There may be others. I haven't heard any estimates coming from the Syrian government, but certainly it will be a huge sum.
And does Russia recognize its responsibility in needing to repair the damage it's responsible for?
Well, Russia recognizes its responsibility for achieving the result of its military involvement, which is destroying the assets and the basis of terrorist organizations in Syria. We are also involved in promoting a political solution in Syria.
Indeed, and you're also responsible for ensuring that President Assad is still in power and in control of much of Syria, and yet you're asking the EU to pay reconstruction money, which would effectively prop him up more.
Well, I would put it differently, because any reconstruction money properly channeled would lead to reconstructing the housing, the facilities, including hospitals and schools, roads, bridges, some of which have been destroyed, some of them by the US-led coalition, which did not hesitate to bomb infrastructure facilities.
The argument that other countries should put money in for reconstruction surely can be made when there is peace. Does Russia fully support the Geneva peace process?
Certainly it does. But the problem with the Geneva peace process from the outset, and the reason why it has barely moved forward for quite some time, was that the initial idea, as described in the relevant UN Security Council resolution, was to bring together the Syrian government and a combined delegation, a representative delegation of the Syrian opposition. The Syrian government came there, but those people who claimed to represent the Syrian opposition came from all sorts of places. London, Istanbul, Riyadh, but not Syria proper.
But my question to you was how it fits in. Do the Sochi talks take account of what has already been agreed in the Geneva peace process, not least that there will be a transitional government and President Assad will not be, it does not represent the future of Syria?
Actually, that was not agreed in Geneva. There is an understanding described in the UN, in the Geneva conclusions of 2012, that there will be a political transition, yes, but not in the current
Okay,
Geneva
so you
document.
accept that President Assad will not remain as president of Syria once this peace process is over?
Once there are elections and somebody else is elected.
But that could take years.
No, not necessarily, because part of this political process would be to draft a new constitution and hold elections on its basis.
There's a UN diplomat who says of the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, that so far Sochi doesn't pass the smell test. You are not seen as an honest broker.
Well, it's unfair, to say the least.
Do you seriously think that Russia, via this process, can bring peace to Syria?
ultimately, it's only the Syrians who can bring peace to their country. Our goal, and I hope the goal of all others, including the European Union, is to contribute to that happening under the auspices of the United Nations, definitely.
So whatever happens at Sochi will then feed in to the Geneva?
Precisely.
So you are fully brought up to the UN overseeing this?
Yes. Both Sochi and Astana will feed into the Geneva process.
It seems almost as though Russia's had enough of it now. President Putin says mission accomplished. But given his aims at the outset of stabilizing the legitimate power in Syria and creating the conditions for political compromise, there is no political compromise.
Well, I believe that now that the hostilities are mostly over, of course there will be pockets of and flare-ups of military clashes. That's inevitable in any conflict of that dimension. But we can now think and actually proceed more actively along the path of a political solution.
And the intensified campaign that we're seeing in places like Eastern Ghouta, is that a sort of final, effectively permission for President Assad, the Syrian regime, to do what they can? And there have been suggestions that chlorine gas, that chemical weapons have again been used, which at the very least Russia must be complicit in.
Well, until I see evidence, hard evidence, of anything like that happening, I am not prepared to discuss it.
You've seen the pictures, you've seen the reports
well,
of
you
the
know,
effects of the bombing.
Throughout the conflict in Syria, I've seen hundreds of pictures and videos staged of ostensibly chemical attacks.
Could the Syrian regime use chemical weapons without Russian knowledge?
Well, I think that to begin with, the Syrian government, which you prefer to call regime, I call it government, has no reason to use chemical weapons.
But it's a different question. If I accept what you are saying, that there is no evidence, let's accept that.
Yeah.
So what I'm curious about is the process, the way things work in Syria. And I'm wondering if it's possible that Syrian planes could use chemical weapons without Russian knowledge, if not authority.
To begin with, the Syrian Arab Republic, the government, has got rid of all its chemical weapons, and that has been recognized by international institutions. You refer to chlorine. Chlorine is not a chemical weapon, technically
So chlorine
speaking.
would be fine to use?
No, of course not. But it is known that some opposition groups have been using chlorine.
You've said that there is a probability that the EU will lift sanctions on Russia this year. They've only just extended them unanimously. What makes you say that?
Well, of course, I'm not going to speculate when the EU will take any decision on that or any other issue. It's up to them. But what I sense is that there is growing understanding within the European Union of the need to reconsider its position on those so-called sanctions.
Now, they were put in place until there was full implementation of the Minsk agreement.
No, they were put in place originally in order to convince all parties concerned, including Russia, to start negotiations. And that happened in February 2015. So those sanctions that had been imposed the year before, in 2014, should have been lifted there and then.
You have had warm words, not least from the German Foreign Minister, Sigmar Gabriel, who's suggesting that actually Russia should be rewarded if the ceasefire holds, which it patently hasn't done in years. Is that your position, that if Russia can ensure that those separatists in the east and those on the Ukrainian side can hold a ceasefire, then the sanctions should be lifted?
It's not an issue. We are not negotiating this issue of so-called sanctions with the European Union, with the United States or anybody else. it's not an issue for negotiation. The European Union has drawn itself into a corner, I would say, by those decisions. So the moment the EU manages to collect enough political will to reconsider its position and pull itself back from that corner, they will know where to find us.
So your belief is that even without a ceasefire, the sanctions will be lifted?
Well, technically speaking, there is a ceasefire.
In name only?
Well, there are numerous violations, I agree, unfortunately. But like in Syria, you can never have a watertight ceasefire in conflicts like this.
So, but you may be having various EU countries coming around. Of course, you've got the opposite in the United States, where there's a new sanctions threat. And the threat of, if the sanctions that have been signed in but not implemented by President Trump, in the words of the chief executive of Sberbank, said that if they were imposed, they would make the Cold War look like child's play.
Well,
is he right?
He's in a better position than myself to count the figures.
He didn't think they would be imposed, but the point what he was making is that they are a very sizable threat that would have a huge impact on Russia.
Well, so far the impact of any of those restrictive measures on Russian economy has been palpable, but not very extensive. Actually, in some sectors of the Russian economy, particularly in agriculture, for example, the producers are actually happy and asking the government to make sure the
sanctions stay. So they're a good thing. Bring them on. Let's have more sanctions. Seriously?
Well, this is the view of those producers.
What's your view?
My view that as a result of those decisions, our relations with the European Union are in abnormal state today. It's not only the restrictive measures as such, but it's also the lack of proper dialogue and cooperation.
You've been Russia's top diplomat here for years, for
yes.
many, many years. Are things as bad now as they've ever been?
Well, I've seen a number of ups and downs. I will not say that the crisis in Ukraine was the starting point of the current difficulties. Some of them predate the beginning of that crisis. I would say that the Ukrainian crisis could be more accurately described as a catalyst of those tendencies. But certainly there will be a common effort needed to overcome this current state of affairs.
But they've got worse, not least because what Russia has been charged with doing in other countries' democracies. It's been going, the accusations have increased over years, the latest from the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, saying that Russia's been deploying its state-run media to plant fake stories and photoshopped images, to sow discord in the West, undermine our institutions. She has a simple message for Russia. We know what you are doing, and you will not succeed.
Well, unfortunately, I need to say at this point that evidently the virus of anti-Russian hysteria that was cultivated on the other side of the Atlantic due to domestic political complications there has managed to cross the Atlantic somehow and has infiltrated the minds of certain elements of political elites in European countries.
So the fact that the suggestion that that there are more than 19 European countries where there has been accusation that Russia has interfered in their democracy.
The virus is contagious.
It's just paranoia on their part, on Germany, France, Spain, Norway, Italy, Greece.
Not a shred of evidence has appeared so far, either in the United States or in any of those European countries, So it's more, I would say, an issue of psychiatry rather than diplomacy.
That is, of course, a different answer. You might accept that there's not a shred of evidence, but it may be happening. Can you say categorically that it isn't happening?
I can say categorically that it's not happening.
That there is no Russian orchestrated attempts to influence the outcome of campaigns to Russia's benefit?
Certainly not.
The effect of all this is, as you say, that relations with countries are not as they should be. Now,
unfortunately, that is correct.
what effect does that have?
Well, you might say that I should feel frustrated, but actually I am not. I feel the need to concentrate my efforts and those of my colleagues here to work. Actually, I'll tell you that in the last 3 or 4 years, the volume of work has just increased. Though, okay, we used to have 2 summits a year, we used to have numerous ministerial meetings, not since 2014, but we need to continue to represent Russian policy, Russian interests, and defend Russian interests in many cases.
And when you have meetings with your counterparts here in Brussels,
Yeah.
are they frostier than they used to be?
Some of them are, but I would say that's a minority, because mostly people, particularly when you discuss something one-to-one, it's normal discussions like we used to have.
And the arrival of President Trump in the White House, been the president now for a year, has that affected the way that different EU nations see Russia?
Like I told you, this virus of anti-Russian hysteria that was born in the United States, cultivated perhaps, I am not an expert in US domestic politics, but cultivated by those who lost the election, it has somehow managed to cross the Atlantic and found some fertile ground in some parts of European countries' political elites.
So, but what I was wondering in a way is whether the President Trump in the White House means that EU countries are turning to Russia more because he's perhaps less removed from the international scene than his predecessors.
Well, I would say that we are open for cooperation, both with European Union countries and also with the United States and others. But in the case of the United States, it takes at least 2 to tango. In the case of the European Union, it takes 29 so far.
Vladimir Chizhov, thank you for coming on
Thank
HARDtalk.
you.
This edition of Hard Talk was presented by me, Sarah Montague. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.